Hod the bus and wait till we tell you what's been going on in Scotland. Nicola Sturgeon's decision to step down as First Minister and leader of the SNP took pretty much everyone bar her by surprise. Now, she remains in post until the end of March, whilst the party she's led since 2014 works out who best to fill her shoes. And let's just say the candidates haven't exactly been playing nicely.
When you were Transport Minister, the trains were never on time. When you were Justice Minister, the police were strained to breaking point. And now, as Health Minister, we've got record high waiting times.
In the first week of your campaign, you had people who voted yes, leave your campaign.
As I've just said, the mudslinging on this needs to stop, and I'm calling for calm.
Accusations of homophobia, blue on blue, or should that be yellow on yellow attacks over the party's record in government, briefing and counter-briefing, and they all have to work with each other afterwards. And what of their ultimate goal? Not the job of First Minister, but being the politician that secures Scotland its independence. Or with the departure of the most successful politician in Scotland's history, is this the beginning of the end of the SNP's dominance of Scottish politics? I'm Niall Paterson, and this is the Sky News Daily. He's been very busy of late, our Scotland correspondent Conor Gillis, but he's dragged himself away from following the candidates Kate Forbes, Ash Regan and Humza Yousaf. Conor, we will go through their separate pitches in just a moment, but first, explain the process that the SNP follows. You know, we've had a few leadership contests over the past few years.
Yeah, I think it's worth reiterating and remembering that actually, yes, the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, politics across the UK has been turbulent in terms of leaders coming and going, but actually the SNP has not had a leadership contest for almost 20 years. So the ballot itself opens on Monday the 13th. That is when the roughly 100,000 SNP members will begin that process, will begin their proper deliberations as to who they want to succeed Nicola Sturgeon as leader of the party, but of course, essentially electing the next First Minister of Scotland. That ballot will remain open for a number of weeks and then come to its final crescendo, the peak in this contest on the 27th of March, when we will discover who the next SNP leader is, and of course, ultimately the next First Minister of Scotland.
Walk us through the three candidates then. Well known in Scotland, perhaps not as much so elsewhere, and we should probably start with Humza Yousaf, the Health Secretary. I'm going to say that if you are looking for a continuity candidate, then it would probably be him.
I think that's what Humza Yousaf would say as well. He has had many senior positions within the Scottish Government over the course of the last 10 years or so. He was a junior minister for Europe back in the day, progressed on to Transport Minister, then became Justice Secretary, and latterly and most recently is now the Health Secretary in charge of an NHS that is in crisis. He has come under sustained criticism, sustained scrutiny over his handling of the health service in Scotland. So I think it is fair to say he is favoured among the senior figures in terms of the SNP hierarchy to continue on that mantle that Nicola Sturgeon has built.
I mean, Humza Yousaf himself, you know, the backstory is remarkable. You know, youngest MSP, first non-white, first Muslim minister in Holyrood. I have to say, though, looking forward, if he sticks to Nicola Sturgeon's strategy, plans, you know, to the letter, he's going nowhere. So what is he going to do that's different?
There's the school of thought within the SNP that love what Nicola Sturgeon carved and what she built. And then there's the other school of thought who think, well, actually, the issues in the last couple of months that arguably led to the downfall of Nicola Sturgeon, namely the gender reforms that the Scottish Parliament voted through just before Christmas, which essentially is a historic piece of legislation that makes it easier for people to change their legally recognised gender. It's a system of self-identification. It's unlike the rest of the UK. And Humza Yousaf has been clear that he was for that policy. He voted for that policy. He would continue to push that policy. And the Westminster government has been in a situation where it doesn't believe potentially that legislation is legal, and it is attempting to block it at the moment. Humza Yousaf has been clear that he would go through with a legal challenge on that because he says this is about much more than the gender policy itself.
What you should not oppose, what you cannot oppose,
is that it should be the Scottish people's right to choose. That right of when to have a referendum should be ours, should be made by the Scottish Parliament, by the Scottish people, not by Boris Johnson or the Westminster government.
Second of all, of course, the key issue of independence. He has been clear that he would not use the next general election as essentially a de facto independence referendum.
That's a big break from the Sturgeon policy agenda.
It is, but I think there's a recognition that independence is not going to happen anytime soon in Scotland, the way things are at the moment. And I think that was what Nicola Sturgeon realised quite clearly as well, and was one of the reasons why she had to go.
Well, let's talk about Ash Regan then. You'll need to tell us a little bit more about her. She is perhaps the least well-known of the candidates, but if you want a defender of the independence faith, I mean, you've got it in her.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that, Humza Yousaf might not be known south of Gretna Green. Ash Regan might not be known outside of the Holyrood bubble at all. Got into politics just a number of years ago and has not been a high-profile politician until she took a stance on that gender reform policy that we discussed a second ago. She was in Nicola Sturgeon's government as a minister, and she said she could not vote for that. And she was the first SNP minister since the SNP came to power in 2007 to resign from the government on a matter of policy.
The FID was not in the manifesto, so we just need to be very clear about that. It was not in the manifesto. And I actually was one of many SNP colleagues who signed an open letter to the newspapers in 2019 about these exact issues. So I think it's not credible to say that my views on this subject were not well known.
I mean, that's incredible. The SNP have long been known as the steadiest of ships. Whenever there are rows, whenever there are arguments outside of this leadership campaign, of which more later, they tend to take place behind closed doors.
Absolutely. This is a party of discipline. It's a party of unity. And the gender row, the gender debate, the toxic debate that came with that has caused splits, it's caused divisions among colleagues in a really open and public way that the SNP has not been famous for over the course of the last couple of years. And a face of that has been Ash Regan, and she would not challenge the Westminster legal route that Humza Yousaf would.
Well, let's talk then about perhaps the strongest challenger to Humza Yousaf, Kate Forbes, the Finance Secretary. And again, this will be a name that some people in the South recognise, perhaps because of her stance over same-sex marriage. Explain that one.
Yeah, so Kate Forbes came into politics a couple of years ago. She became the Finance Secretary in charge of Scotland's finances essentially overnight, and has been seen ever since as a rising star within the SNP ranks. She went off on maternity leave last year. Her baby's about 6 months old now, and this contest has forced her back earlier than she was predicting. But she's been clear since she came back, the first day that she appeared on this campaign trail to put her name forward for the next SNP leader, for the next First Minister of Scotland. She told some of my colleagues here in Scotland that she would not have voted for equal marriage had she been an MSP at the time, back in 2014. And then when I sat down with her just a couple of hours after that, I questioned her about her religious beliefs, because she says religion is the reason she wouldn't have voted for same-sex marriage.
Is it correct for people to have children before marriage?
It's entirely up to them.
What's your view? Is it correct for children, for people across Scotland to have children outside of marriage?
It's not. It's something that I would seek to avoid for me personally, but it doesn't fuss me. Doesn't put me up nor down. The choices that other people make.
Is it right or is it right or is it wrong in your view?
In terms of my faith would say that children. Well, it says sex is for marriage. And that's the approach that I would practice.
So that created a huge storm and set her back. She lost a lot of high-profile supporters within the SNP, MPs, MSPs north of the border who had publicly backed her. U-turned on that, switched sides to Humza Yousaf instead, and that created a big issue.
Yeah, sure, but I really cannot get my head around that for so long now the SNP have styled themselves as incredibly socially progressive, and there is a chance, a very real chance, that the next leader of the SNP, the next First Minister of Scotland, will be someone who does not believe in same-sex marriage and who presumably believes an awful lot of other things that would not sit particularly well with the majority of grassroots SNP supporters?
She would say, and she has done over the course of this campaign, as she tried to reset following those very highly controversial comments at the start, that she can have her own personal views. She has set Scottish budgets and she hasn't brought prejudice into the mix when it comes to that. And she would govern in the same way that she has governed the finances as well. But during the course of the last week or so, there has been a number of televised debates, and they have been incredibly ugly. We heard from Kate Forbes attacking Humza Yousaf. Let's just remember that Kate Forbes, albeit she's been on maternity leave, but she is a current serving finance secretary at the moment. She was on television attacking Humza Yousaf, the current serving health secretary, both in the same government, both in the same party, essentially throwing Humza Yousaf under the bus on national television.
You've had a number of jobs in government. When you were Transport Minister, the trains were never on time. When you were Justice Minister, the police were strained to breaking point. And now, as Health Minister, we've got record high waiting times. What makes you think you can do a better job as First Minister?
This was a public spat, and essentially cabinet ministers suggesting that colleagues are unfit to govern, questioning their competence. And the question that came from that is, how on earth does the party come back from that after all of this? And that's a huge question that kind of lingers and is of grave concern for many in the party.
I mean, on a personal level, away from the kind of the public policy and stuff, what do you make of the three of them?
I mean, there have been light-hearted moments. Humza Yousaf said to me a couple of weeks ago that he feels that he's been interviewed more and seen me more than his wife over the course of this campaign, which shows you
Oh, poor Humza.
how many questions he's been fielding. Kate Forbes, she was very relaxed, almost too relaxed, actually, following that pretty car crash interview where she talked about children outside of marriage. Afterwards, I don't think she quite, maybe she did realise that what she was saying and the reaction that was going to trigger across the SNP movement. Ash Regan, I think she's different to the rest. I don't know her as much for the reasons that we've already discussed. And her interview was slightly different in a way that she couldn't really answer questions. I got the impression, and this is a personal reflection, that there was maybe a suggestion she was potentially trying to make some things up on the hoof.
To say that the SNP are the dominant force in Scottish politics would be an understatement. And with Nicola Sturgeon off to pursue other opportunities, whoever takes over has some very big shoes to fill. And a support base whose desire for independence ASAFP cannot be ignored. Strathclyde University's election expert, Professor John Curtice, is here. And John, let's start with those who actually get to choose the next First Minister, SNP members. How are they feeling about the candidates?
Well, we've only so far had one poll of SNP members themselves, and it was a relatively small poll of around 500 people. But headline number one from that was an awful lot of them hadn't made up their minds. 1 in 3 said they didn't know how they were going to vote. But amongst that group, Humza Yousaf was narrowly ahead of Kate Forbes by 31% to 25%, with Ash Regan, as in all the other polling, well behind at around the 10% mark or so. So the truth is that it certainly looks as though it's a two-horse race. And I think the honest truth is, as we speak, we're not entirely sure which of them is going to win.
So then if we kind of cast our eyes slightly further and talk about the population in general, I mean, clearly the SNP have been dominant in Scottish politics for a long time. That in part, I would say, has been to do with the person at the top, Alex Salmond, and then, of course, at Nicola Sturgeon. I mean, with the public at large, does it still stack up pretty much the same, kind of a two-horse race?
It is a two-horse race as far as the general public is concerned, but it's a two-horse race with a rather different character. In some senses, there is a feature of this election which is very similar to that of the Conservative leadership election last year. If the general public had been voting last year, then Rishi Sunak would almost undoubtedly won, but so far as members were concerned, it was Liz Truss. Well, I've already told you that Mr. Yousaf is ahead amongst the members, so far as we know, and indeed it now looks as though on the more recent polling is that he's at least neck and neck with Miss Forbes amongst SNP voters. Indeed, one poll puts him ahead. But when it comes to the general public, all of the polling so far has suggested that Miss Forbes is ahead. But of course, that illustrates her problem, which is that it might be, that she might be better able than Mr. Yousaf to appeal to those who are not currently SNP supporters, to those who are not yet currently minded to vote yes to independence. But in order to get the opportunity to be able to do that, she first of all needs to be able to win this election, which is amongst the 100,000 or so people that are members of the SNP. So at the moment, she's got to find a way of appealing to that group if she's going to be able to capitalise upon what might be potentially a greater ability to reach out more widely to the Scottish public.
But explain this one to me if you can. Why has it proved so difficult for Nicola Sturgeon and will prove difficult for the candidates, whoever is successful, to get that persistent majority support for independence? I was in Scotland covering the referendum. I went back up in, I think, around about March of 2014, when I think they were polling in the low 30s. By the end of that campaign, they'd gotten all the way to 45. We're almost a decade on. That's an awful lot of young people enthused by the campaign who have now got the opportunity to vote. I mean, why have we not got above that 50% and stayed there?
Well, the truth is, I mean, support for independence since about 2019 has tended to oscillate around the 49% mark. And there is no doubt that a big challenge facing the next SNP leader is simply to get the debate started, to get people talking about it. You know, at the end of the day, Scotland is not going to vote for independence or not because of people's views about the GRR bill or indeed about gay marriage. These are not going to be central issues in the campaign. The lesson of 2014 is that the central issue that is most likely to determine how people will vote in any independence referendum is the issue of economics. And that is the issue that, so far at least, the candidates have not released any degree of detail indicated their standpoint.
Just a word from you, John, then, on Nicola Sturgeon herself and, you know, the future of the party that she leaves behind. I mean, certainly one of the most successful in electoral terms politicians that we have ever seen in this country, totemic to the independence movement. I mean, I keep hearing people, particularly on the unionist side, suggesting that this is the point at which the SNP's dominance in Scottish politics will begin to end. What's your view?
Well, the answer is that the downside risks to the SNP are clear. They're essentially twofold. One is that voters will come away with the impression that the party is divided and that the sores that will undoubtedly be exposed during this leadership campaign already have been exposed, that they will not be healed. And number two, that whoever is the leader, as we've been discussing, fails indeed to be able to develop a case for independence, and in the wake of that, support for independence goes down. The electoral fortunes of the SNP these days are very, very intimately tied up with the level of support for independence. That's a risk, there is no doubt about it, but it's not guaranteed. And one has to say that so far, at least, for example, the theories that were out there that now it's obvious that the Labour Party, or at least the Labour Party's got a good chance of winning the UK election, that support for independence would go down. Well, no immediate sign of that being true. We may well, I think, certainly discover some bumpiness in support for the SNP and for independence during the course of this leadership debate. I think there's already some signs of that in the polls. But frankly, we won't know what the fallout is until we know who has won and with what authority.
Professor Curtice, thank you. Back to you, Connor. Now, of course, I cannot believe for a second that Nicola Sturgeon would have overtly endorsed any of the candidates. You just simply don't do that when you're in the position that she's in. But has she perhaps, given us a nod and a wink?
No, to be totally frank. However, I think that there is a sense within the campaign, and when I say the campaign, I'm talking the Ash Regan and the Kate Forbes campaign, that Humza Yousaf is being geared up, and this is their point of view, is being engineered is being coronated into this position to take over from Nicola Sturgeon in terms of the high-profile support, and attempts are being made to ostracise Kate Forbes as part of this. So this is a difficult position for the SNP. It's a difficult position for the First Minister, who can't have a view in this, but is the headquarters, is the machine, the powerhouse that is the SNP, playing a part in this campaign, not in a direct way, but in a very subtle way that plays into the hands of one candidate over another.
I remember Nicola Sturgeon claiming as recently as 2021 that the SNP was the most united of all the parties in Scotland. At the end of it will not be. So whoever takes over has an almighty job on their hands, don't they? Not just to push for independence, not just to get Scotland back on an even keel, but to actually reunite the Scottish National Party.
Whoever wins this contest not only has a mountain to climb when it comes to policy, has the challenges of trying to deliver independence for a movement who are itching at the bit to try and achieve their mission over the course of decades and decades of work. But as you said, this is a party that is now synonymous over the course of the last couple of weeks for infighting, for bitter disputes, public spats, and Nicola Sturgeon will be watching this unravel in front of her eyes from behind the couch, and probably never in a million years would have realised that this is what would have triggered on. But many commentators here in Scotland say this is part of Nicola Sturgeon's doing, because in a way that Alex Salmond geared Nicola Sturgeon up to be the natural successor, Nicola Sturgeon has not done that. And that has led to 3 contenders getting in the mix here, and for the very public spats that there have been. And actually, it's the party and it's the independence movement that will suffer and could have long-lasting impacts that push independence even further into the distance.
My thanks to Conor Gillies, to Sir John Curtice, and of course to you for listening to the Sky News Daily with me, Niall Paterson. This episode was produced by Rosie Gillett with Alex Eden. Our editor is Philly Beaumont.